I paid $200, but something beneath the stage was still waiting.
She was 22 and homeless. No coat worth winter, no room key, no family waiting, just a canvas tool bag and $213 she had hidden inside its torn lining. And with $200, she bought an abandoned Grand Theater standing forgotten in Wayne County, Michigan since the winter of 1978. Half the balcony had fallen into the seats. Rain had rotted the velvet curtains to threads. The county condemned it on March 14, 2001 and scheduled demolition for the coming spring. But beneath the wooden stage trapdoor, unopened for nearly 50 years, waited a sealed vault, $85,000, and the lost words of a dead playwright. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Evelyn Mercer had been listening her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she could tell which neighbor was climbing the apartment stairs by the rhythm of the steps. Mrs. Lowe dragged her left heel. The mail carrier struck each landing twice. Her father climbed softly as though arriving late were a kindness. Clara stored these sounds without names, arranging them in her mind the way other children kept colored stones. Her father Daniel repaired heating systems until a burst valve burned both hands and ended the work. After that, he spoke less and sat near the kitchen radiator, turning its loose brass knob with a folded handkerchief. He died when Clara was 11, leaving behind one blue work shirt that her mother washed but never wore or discarded. The person who taught Clara what listening could become was her grandfather, Elias Mercer, a stage director whose name had once appeared in small gold letters outside theaters from Cleveland to Chicago. Every Saturday, he collected her from the apartment and took her to a windowless rehearsal room above a Detroit costume shop. There he made thunder with sheet metal rain, with dried peas rolled through a wooden drum, and the sound of a horse crossing packed earth with 2 coconut shells cupped against a sanded board. He never let her begin with the object. First, he described the place: a road after rain, a distant train platform, a kitchen where someone had just received bad news. Then Clara closed her eyes, listened to his imitation, and chose the material that might carry the same weight. Sometimes she failed for an hour. Elias would adjust the angle of her wrist by half an inch and ask her to try again. Sound is not noise, Clara. It is evidence. He meant that every honest sound revealed what had touched what, how hard, and for how long. A careless effect merely filled silence. An exact one allowed an unseen world to stand upright. Elias died during a February freeze when Clara was 17. His landlord cleared the rehearsal room before the family arrived. The thunder sheet went to a scrapyard. The rain drum disappeared. His notebooks, cue cards, wooden clappers, and battered leather case were divided among strangers who believed they were removing junk. Clara kept only the canvas tool bag he had carried for 40 years. By 22, she lived with her mother in a narrow apartment on Cass Avenue above a laundromat that trembled through the floor each morning at 6. Their landlord had sold the building to Victor Sloan, a city developer whose photographs appeared beside polished models of parking structures and luxury offices. Sloan never raised his voice. He sent notices on heavy cream paper, each sentence shaped to appear inevitable. Surveyors came first. Then men in clean boots marked the brick with orange paint. Tenants were promised relocation meetings that were repeatedly postponed. Sloan's assistants measured doorways while people were still cooking dinner. By October, the electricity failed twice each week and the furnace remained cold. On November 6, 2021, Clara returned from a dishwashing shift carrying a chipped white bowl wrapped in newspaper. The street was blocked by metal fencing. A demolition excavator stood with its bucket resting against the building's opened face. Her 4th-floor room was already exposed to the sky. She could see her mattress folded beneath broken plaster and one sleeve of her father's blue shirt moving in the wind. A security guard placed a hand against the gate. "The demolition order is signed. You cannot enter." Exactly 8 words, delivered without cruelty and without room for appeal. Her mother stood beside Sloan's portable office, holding a relocation envelope against her coat. She had signed the waiver that morning, accepting a payment large enough for 1 bus ticket and a rented room in Toledo. Clara looked at her. Her mother lowered her eyes and tightened both hands around the envelope. The excavator lifted again. The chipped bowl slipped from Clara's arms and broke on the pavement. She gathered one curved piece, placed it inside Elias's canvas bag, and walked away before the next wall came down. For 6 weeks, the bag served as pillow cupboard and locked room. Clara spent 3 nights in the waiting area of Detroit's Greyhound station until an employee began recognizing her. She rode a city bus to Dearborn and slept behind a 24-hour bakery where warm yeast drifted through a vent until dawn. Her money fell from $186 to $159. In Toledo, she found her mother's rented house but did not knock. A lace curtain moved in the front window. Clara stood beneath a bare maple for 9 minutes, then returned to the station. She slept 2 nights in a church basement on Collingwood Boulevard, 1 night sitting upright in a hospital lobby, and 4 beneath the overhang of a closed furniture warehouse. She bought crackers, canned peaches, and single cups of coffee when the cold became difficult to hold inside her body. By early December, she had $127. A shelter bed opened in Ann Arbor, but only for 3 nights. She washed Elias's bag in a sink and dried it beneath a hand blower. The hidden seam in its lining came loose. Inside were $86 he had folded into a waxed paper packet along with a note in his narrow handwriting for the place that listens back. She now had $213. The following afternoon, Clara entered the downtown public library to escape sleet. She read the newspapers because they cost nothing, and because classified pages sometimes offered cleaning work. Near the bottom of a county disposal notice between a tax auction and a listing for used church pews, she found 7 lines in small print. Grand Theater, Detroit Municipal Surplus, structurally unsafe, contents included, buyer assumes all liability, sealed bid minimum $200. A grainy photograph showed a stone facade blackened by weather, 5 boarded doors, and the faint curve of an old marquee. Someone had written demolition pending across the image. Clara copied the address onto the back of her grandfather's note. She counted her money beneath the table, set aside $13 for food and transportation, and filled out the bid form with the library's chained pen. At closing time, she carried the envelope through the sleet to the municipal records building. The night clerk accepted it without looking up. Clara kept one hand on the canvas bag as the envelope disappeared through the brass slot. 3 days later, the city called the shelter desk. No other bid had been submitted. Clara boarded the westbound bus with $13, a broken piece of white china, and a deed to a theater whose stage had been silent longer than she had been alive. The bus carried Clara through wet farmland before dawn, its windows clouded by the breath of 7 passengers and a heater that clicked without giving warmth. Her ticket reached only as far as Dearborn. From there she walked 11 miles east with Elias's bag across one shoulder, following Michigan Avenue beneath a sky the color of unpolished tin. By afternoon, freezing rain had soaked the knees of her trousers. She left the road near an abandoned produce stand and found a hay barn behind a leaning farmhouse, its door chained but open wide enough at one corner for her to enter. The loft smelled of dust mice and old summer. She buried herself beneath loose hay, keeping the deed inside her shirt. At midnight, the temperature fell to 19 degrees. Each time she woke, she counted the folded pages with her fingertips. She began walking again before sunrise. Detroit rose gradually around her freight yards, brick factories with blind windows, church towers, and blocks where snow gathered against vacant doorways. Near the old theater district, she passed Calder's Shoe Repair, the Olympia Lunch Counter, St. Vincent Pharmacy, Belrose Tailoring, and Morrow Hardware, all occupying narrow storefronts beneath apartments whose fire escapes were silver with ice. Only the lunch counter was open. A woman inside turned its sign from closed to open, but did not see Clara standing across the street. The Wayne County Clerk's Annex occupied the first floor of a limestone building on Randolph Street. Clara entered through a revolving door that resisted her weight, then crossed a lobby where wet boots had left dark commas on the marble. A guard directed her to property disposition. The office contained 4 metal desks, a clock that ran 3 minutes slow, and filing cabinets painted the brown-green of old machinery. Behind the final desk sat a woman with one silver eyebrow that rose higher than the other. Her nameplate read MRS Loretta Baines, Senior Records Clerk. Mrs. Baines examined Clara's identification, then the receipt for the bid. "You came alone." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk removed her glasses and placed them precisely on a blotter. "You understand the city will not repair the roof." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the balcony is under a collapse order." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no active water heat or electrical service." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that if an inspector finds immediate danger to the public, the building may still be closed with you inside it." Clara rested both hands on Elias's bag. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Baines studied her for several seconds. Then she opened a ledger nearly as wide as the desk and drew the deed toward her. The property description occupied 2 pages, lot boundaries, old easements, unpaid assessments forgiven under the disposal program, and an inventory clause transferring everything fixed or abandoned within the structure. Clara signed 3 times. The clerk pressed a brass stamp into a black pad and brought it down with a weighty mechanical snap. She turned the deed, stamped the reverse, then slid a single iron key across the desk. "West on Monroe to Grand River. South side after the boarded hotel. The alley entrance is safer than the front. Do not step beneath the balcony." Clara folded the deed along its original crease. Mrs. Baines had begun entering the sale into a typewriter when she stopped. Her finger remained above the M key. "Mercer," she said. "Your middle name is Evelyn." Clara looked up. The clerk opened the ledger again, this time near the back where earlier ownership transfers had been copied in fading blue ink. She ran one finger down a column and turned the book so Clara could read. Elias Mercer, Artistic Director, Licensed Occupant, Lower Rehearsal Rooms, 1963-1978. "You knew him?" Clara asked. "Not well. My father cleaned boilers for the theaters." Mrs. Baines touched the line without covering it. "Mr. Mercer stayed after the Grand stopped selling enough tickets to pay the musicians. He directed radio plays on that stage and taught young performers how to move without microphones." Clara had known about Cleveland, Chicago, and the rehearsal room above the costume shop. Elias had never mentioned the Grand. I left before it closed. I was the last one with a regular key. Mrs. Baines's high eyebrow lowered. The city sealed the building after a winter pipe burst. Your grandfather came here for 6 months asking permission to remove property from beneath the stage. The department said the floor was unsafe. What property? I never wrote it on the request. Mrs. Baines pulled open the top drawer and took out a narrow card browned at the edges. Elias's signature appeared at the bottom, unmistakable in its sloping patience. Above it, beneath requested access, he had typed only 4 words. Lower trap assembly, personal effects. The request had been denied on January 9, 1979. Mrs. Baines copied the card and placed the copy inside Clara's deed. The original stays here. Thank you. The clerk nodded once, as though thanks were unnecessary between people handling facts. Before Clara reached the door, Mrs. Baines called after her. Your grandfather made a train wreck once. Clara turned. For a radio drama, the clerk said, there was no train. Just a coal scuttle, 2 cabinet doors, and a length of chain. My father heard it from the boiler room and ran upstairs because he believed the roof had fallen. The silver eyebrow lifted again. I was exact. Outside, the freezing rain had become fine snow. Clara followed Monroe Street beneath dark office windows, carrying the key in her palm. On Grand River Avenue, traffic thinned and the buildings grew older. A man sweeping salt outside a pawn shop watched her pass but offered no question. Farther on, an elderly neighbor in a brown overcoat stood beside a chain-link fence while a black and white dog pressed its nose through the mesh. You headed to the Grand, he asked. Clara stopped. The man looked at the iron key. Figured someone bought it. Is the alley open? Mostly. Watch the bricks behind the fly tower. He gave the dog's collar a gentle tug. This is Amos. He'll bark tonight, but not at you. Beyond the fence, 3 walnut trees grew from a vacant lot, their branches holding small cups of snow. Clara followed them toward the rear of the block. The theater occupied nearly half an acre, 80 feet across at the facade and more than 140 feet deep. Its lower walls were pale limestone. The upper stories were red brick darkened by soot. Copper flashing had peeled from the roof, leaving one corner exposed, and the fly tower leaned just enough to make the eye return to it. A square chimney rose beside the backstage wall. Above the boarded entrance, the Grand Theater sign remained in place, though only the letters G, A, and T retained their glass faces. The alley door was oak wrapped in rusted steel. Clara cleared ice from the lock with the edge of the broken china bowl, inserted the key, and leaned her shoulder into the door. It opened 6 inches, stopped against fallen plaster, then yielded with a long wooden groan. Cold air passed over her, carrying wet stone, old fabric, and the sour trace of standing water. She entered sideways and shut the door behind her. The rear corridor was narrow and black. Her fingertips found flaking paint along one wall while her boots tested each board before accepting her weight. Somewhere ahead, water struck metal at steady intervals. The sound traveled through the building and returned altered, as though several distant rooms were answering. She reached the backstage area first. Ropes hung from the fly system in stiff furred lines. A torn canvas flat leaned against the wall, painted with the remains of a moonlit garden. When Clara brushed its edge, dust rose into her mouth with the taste of chalk. The stage lay beyond a curtain reduced to brown-red strips. She stepped through one opening. Even ruined, the auditorium held its shape. Rows of seats descended into darkness. Plaster cherubs watched from the walls with missing hands and softened faces. Half the balcony had collapsed across the center aisle, crushing seats beneath a slope of timber and ornament. Snow entered through a break in the roof and drifted silently onto the upper rail. Clara remained beneath the proscenium where the ceiling appeared sound. She clapped once. The report crossed the hall, struck the rear wall, and returned in layers. First came the hard reflection from plaster, then the hollow answer beneath the balcony. Last came a low wooden resonance directly under her boots. She clapped again. The same 3 answers returned. Behind the stage, she found a former green room containing a cast-iron sink, 2 cracked mirrors, and a wardrobe whose doors had swollen shut. A mouse moved inside the wall with the faint scratch of paper being folded. The adjoining room had no windows and only one exterior leak. Clara chose it for the night. She swept a place with a piece of fallen molding, laid flattened costume boxes over the floor, and placed her coat beneath her head. Dinner was 6 crackers softened with water from her bottle. The cold tightened after dark until each breath touched her face again from the nearby wall. Through the doorway, the stage remained visible as a gray rectangle. Clara took Elias's copied request from the deed and read the 4 words by flashlight. Then she listened to the dripping pipe, the movement of Amos in the neighboring yard, and the timber beneath the stage contracting in the frost. Before sleep, something below the floor answered with one careful knock. For the place that listens back. By sunrise, the knock beneath the stage had become ordinary timber settling under cold. Clara spent the first 3 days making the theater survivable. The service well behind the fly tower still held water, though its hand pump groaned and produced rust-colored liquid for the first 20 strokes. She boiled every cup in a dented costume kettle. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, its roof canted but dry, with a crescent cut into the door and a wasp nest hanging empty above the seat. Inside, she learned the floor one sound at a time. The west aisle creaked sharply near row H. A board outside the wardrobe room gave a soft double complaint. The stage itself changed by location, tight and bright near the footlights hollow at center dull beside the trap assembly. On the fourth morning, Clara walked to Morrow Hardware with a list written on the back of a discarded theater program. The store smelled of machine oil, cedar shavings, and the iron dust that gathered beneath the key-cutting wheel. Narrow drawers covered one wall from floor to ceiling. Behind the counter stood a broad man with a white mustache trimmed square enough to resemble a carpenter's level. He wore a leather apron darkened at the center by years of sharpening tools. His name was Otis Morrow. He read Clara's list, then looked at her boots, which were wrapped at one toe with electrical tape. "I bought the grand." "Yes, sir. People buy trouble every day. They usually choose smaller trouble." He began placing items on the counter. Clara counted the bills in her pocket. "I can pay for some now. I can work for the rest." Otis leaned both hands on the glass case. Beneath them lay brass hinges, cabinet catches, and skeleton keys arranged on faded blue cloth. "What work?" "Cleaning, inventory, window scraping. I can sharpen by hand if the bevel is marked." His eyes moved to Elias's canvas bag. "Mercer, my grandfather's." Otis lifted one drawer beneath the register and removed a gray account book. "I will give you 30 days. No lumber until I see the roof. No power tools until I see your hands. You miss a payment, you come tell me before I have to ask." "I will." "That is not an answer." "I understand." He wrote Clara Mercer Grand Theater on a fresh line and handed her a thin book with a cracked orange cover. "Home repairs for owners of old buildings." "That one is free," he said. "The roof chapter is poor. The chimney chapter may keep you alive." Her first purchases were modest: a stiff wire chimney brush for $6.40, 50 feet of quarter-inch rope for $3.75, work gloves for $2.10, a galvanized bucket for $1.65, 5 pounds of washing soda for 89 cents, and a used claw hammer for $4.25. Otis added a box of bent nails without entering them in the account. "Straighten those before dark," he said. "Then I will know whether you waste iron." Back at the theater, Clara began with the chimney. The square flue served an iron warming stove in the green room and another stove below the stage. She opened both clean-out doors, placed damp canvas over the lower mouths, and tied the brush to the rope. The roof ladder had long since collapsed, so she worked from inside, feeding the brush upward through the lower flue in short, forceful strokes. The first pass returned coated in black glaze. Creosote had hardened along the inner bricks in thick, shining scales. Clara scraped what she could reach with a flattened fireplace poker, then worked the brush again, rotating it a quarter turn after each rise. Soot escaped the canvas and settled across her face. By noon, her gloves had split at one thumb. By 3, her shoulders trembled whenever she lifted the rope. She continued for 6 hours. At dusk, the brush finally rose and fell without catching. Clara removed 3 buckets of soot and creosote from the clean-out, some of it in brittle curls as large as walnut shells. She held a candle near the lower opening. The flame bent steadily toward the flue. The next morning, she inspected the firebox for loose brick, packed 2 shallow gaps with stove cement from Otis's bent nail box, and waited until afternoon before testing it. She began with newspaper, then dry splinters shaved from a broken seat rail. When the draft held, she added 2 narrow pieces of oak. The smoke climbed cleanly. Heat reached the room slowly, first warming the iron door, then the stones beneath it, then Clara's hands. She set the costume kettle on top and cooked oats with half an apple cut into thin pieces. It was the first hot meal she had eaten inside a place she owned. She sat on the floor near the stove, holding the bowl in both hands. Beyond the doorway, the auditorium remained cold enough for snow to persist along the balcony rail, yet the small room smelled of wood smoke and cooked fruit. That evening, she began an inventory of the rooms beneath the stage. The lower corridor was reached by a narrow stair behind the proscenium wall. Water had stained the plaster, but had not reached the storage chambers. In the first room, she found a pair of hinged thunderboards, their leather straps stiff but unbroken. Beside them stood a rain wheel nearly 4 feet across, its inner channels still holding a handful of dried peas. A shelf supported 2 coconut shell halves polished smooth at the edges. There was a canvas bag of gravel labeled Road Dry, a hand-cranked wind machine with torn muslin around its drum, and a shallow wooden box fitted with 6 door latches of different weights. On the floor rested a sheet of galvanized steel bowed at the center where years of hands had flexed it into storms. The final object was a walnut table scarred by knife points and burn marks. Across its front edge, someone had carved 3 initials. E.M. Clara placed both palms on the table and stood without moving. A memory came through the odor of walnut dust. Elias bending above her in the rehearsal room holding 2 coconut shells. He had made her repeat a single walking rhythm until she stopped striking both halves with equal force. "No creature walks evenly," he had said. "That is how the listener knows it is alive." She returned to the present when water tapped somewhere beyond the wall. The lower room ended beneath the main trap mechanism. Its beams were heavier than the surrounding stage supports, joined with square iron bolts and hand-cut washers. Clara examined each one by flashlight. Most carried the same gray dust. One crossbeam did not. A clean arc marked its underside. She tapped it with the hammer. Oak answered solidly. She moved 6 inches to the left and tapped again. The sound changed. Clara tested every foot of the beam, marking the different note with chalk. The hollow section measured 28 inches across. She pressed upward. Nothing moved. She hung the galvanized bucket from a rope and added broken plaster piece by piece, testing whether weight below the beam altered the tone. At 31 pounds, the hollow note deepened. She removed the weight and searched the floor. Beneath the work table, a circular cedar disc had been set flush into the boards. It was no wider than a coffee saucer and nearly invisible beneath dirt. Clara cleared its edge with the point of a bent nail. The disc carried 2 shallow holes placed opposite each other. She inserted the tips of needle-nose pliers and turned. The cedar rotated half a circle. Somewhere above her, iron moved inside wood. Clara stood quickly and listened. The mechanism gave one low click, followed by the soft release of a latch that had waited decades under pressure. She returned to the stage. At center, the trapdoor remained closed, but its rear edge now stood proud of the boards by the width of a coin. She worked the claw of her hammer into the seam and lifted carefully. Cold air rose from below. The door opened onto a compartment built between 2 stage joists, too shallow for a person and lined with tarred canvas. Inside were 6 packages wrapped in oilcloth, a black tin box, and a long leather case secured with a green cord. Clara did not reach for them immediately. She checked the joists for rot, tested the trap hinges, and wedged the door with a section of seat frame. Then she lowered herself beside the opening and removed the packages one at a time, supporting each with both hands. The leather case came first. Its brass clasp opened beneath her thumb. Inside lay Elias's Foley tools, a spring steel door hinge mounted to an oak block, a folding slapstick, 2 wooden clappers, 3 brass bells, and a small hand drill modified to hold stiff cards against a toothed wheel. Each tool had been wrapped in cotton and labeled in his handwriting. Wind distant wire. Door empty house. Footsteps woman tired. The first oilcloth package held Q notebooks tied by year. The second contained 4 coconut shells, one cracked and repaired with copper wire. The third held raw materials, leather straps, steel springs, rosin, muslin, dried seed pods, and narrow pieces of maple marked for shaping. The final 3 packages were heavier. Clara opened them slowly. Inside were bank-wrapped bills, their paper bands browned and brittle, along with canvas coin sacks bearing the names of banks that no longer existed. Beneath them rested a flat parcel sealed in wax. Clara left that parcel unopened. The black tin box required the smallest brass key from the leather case. Within it lay coins arranged in cotton silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters, and Indian head cents, each separated so the edges did not touch. A military medal rested beneath the final layer, darkened almost black except where the ribbon clasp had protected the metal. Spanish War Service. Clara carried everything to the green room, locked the alley door, and counted at the walnut table. The bills totaled $83,600. The coin sacks held another $1,382.47 in spendable currency. The collectible coins were harder to value, so she recorded only their face amounts: 47, Morgan silver dollars 83, Walking Liberty half dollars 112 quarters, and 206 Indian head cents. With the loose bills hidden inside the notebooks, the exact cash total came to $85,012.53. Clara counted it again, then a third time. She wrote the figure on the back page of the repair manual and placed the pencil down. The amount did not make the roof whole. It did not return her father's shirt, the demolished apartment, or Elias's missing years. It merely sat before her in careful stacks, carrying the dust of hands that had chosen not to spend it. The sealed flat parcel remained beside the metal. Across its front, Elias had written her name. Not Clara Mercer. Clara Evelyn, when the building is yours. Night had settled over the theater. Clara could hear traffic on Grand River Avenue and the soft movement of sleet against the boarded doors. She did not break the wax. Instead, she returned every bill and coin to the compartment, keeping only the metal, the addressed parcel, and 1 notebook. She reset the cedar disc, lowered the trapdoor, and dragged the walnut work table over the seam. Then she went outside. The well basin had overflowed during the afternoon, leaving a thin sheet of water beneath the pump. Clara sat on the stone curb while the walnut branches moved above her. Across the alley, Amos lifted his head but did not bark. The water reflected 1 broken theater window and a narrow piece of moon. Clara held the unopened parcel inside her coat until the cold reached through both sleeves. She watched the reflection tremble whenever a drop fell from the pump, then become whole again. For the place that listens back. Morning entered through the broken roof in a pale column that ended at the edge of the stage. Clara carried the sealed parcel to the green room stove, warmed her hands above the iron, and turned it beneath the light. She recognized the slant of the address, but not the steadiness. Elias had written it years before age made his letters narrow and uncertain. She broke the wax with the back of the small brass key. Inside lay 9 pages folded in thirds. My dear one, whoever you are. If this has reached your hands, then the grand belongs to someone willing to kneel on a dirty floor and ask why one board sounds different from another. That is qualification enough. In May of 1977, Dr. Samuel Harrow at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit told me that the weakness in my right hand came from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He advised me to put my affairs in order. I did so badly at first. I sorted papers, argued with the city, and tried to carry too much alone. The work began before me. In 1889, Silas Mercer built stage doors and thunder runs in Pittsburgh. His daughter, Lenora Mercer, brought the trade to Detroit in 1902 and made wind, rain, and carriage sounds for touring companies. Her son, Thomas Elias Mercer, opened a Foley room beneath the Grand in 1926. I, Elias Daniel Mercer, entered that room in 1947 and closed it on October 17, 1978. 4 generations, 4 cities if one counts the years Thomas spent in St. Louis. The names matter, but the work matters more. Silas measured wood by sound. Lenora kept cue times to the quarter second. Thomas taught me never to use a clean object when a worn one told the truth better. My brother James was killed near the Chosin Reservoir in Korea in December 1950. The metal in the tin box was our father's from the Spanish-American War. I kept both histories badly. Silence seemed respectful, and then more than 30 years passed. Silence can preserve a thing, but it can also hide it past usefulness. The money came from royalties, teaching wages, and the sale of 2 properties. It was saved for the Grand, though the city would never let me enter after the pipes burst. Use what is needed to make the building safe. Do not let the money make your decisions faster than your hands can understand them. The tools will still work if they are treated honestly. For rain, use 1 part dried peas to 3 parts small shot in the maple wheel and turn it no faster than 18 revolutions each minute. Warm rosin to about 120 degrees before rubbing the wind drum strap, or it will gather in hard ridges. Soak new leather hinges for 20 minutes, then dry them under weight for a full day. When shaping coconut shells, remove no more than 1/16 of an inch before testing the sound on wood, sand, and stone. A sound effect is not a trick. It is an agreement with the listener. You promise that the unseen door has weight, that the absent horse is tired, that the storm is still beyond the hill. Keep the promise. Inheritance is not the object placed in your hand. It is the task the object asks you to continue. A hammer may remain a hammer for 100 years, but only work keeps the knowledge beside it alive. Behind the theater, the center walnut tree carries an iron plate on its north side. I place something there that belongs with the metal. Leave it until you have survived 1 winter in the building. Some answers should arrive after the roof stops leaking. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Daniel Mercer, February 11, New. Clara read the letter twice. The second reading took longer because she stopped wherever his hand had pressed deeply enough to score the paper. She touched the words right hand, then folded all 9 pages along their original creases, matching each softened corner before returning them to the envelope. She went through the backstage door into clean morning cold. Snow had filled the alley ruts and settled along the pump handle. The 3 walnut trees stood in the vacant lot, each trunk dark with thawing ice. Clara approached the center tree from the north. At shoulder height beneath a fold of bark, she found the edge of an iron plate no larger than her palm. 2 square nails held it in place. Rust had closed the seam, and a shallow symbol had been stamped into its face. 2 curved shells meeting at their narrow ends, the old mark Elias used beside cues for approaching hoofbeats. She placed her fingers against the plate, but did not pry it loose. 1 winter, the letter had said. Clara returned to the theater and opened the leather case. She selected the repaired coconut shells, the pair joined inside by copper wire. Their surfaces had been polished by years of use, pale at the centers and nearly black around the rims. She set a sanded board across 2 crates. At first, the shells produced only hard, empty knocks. Clara loosened her wrists. She shifted 1 strike forward and allowed the second to fall half a beat behind. The sound changed into the patient approach of a tired animal crossing packed ground. She continued until the rhythm reached the far wall and came back whole. That afternoon, small kindnesses began to gather around the building. Otis Morrow arrived with a canvas roll of stove tools and pretended he had brought them only to inspect the flue. The woman from the Olympia lunch counter, whose name was Doris Vale, left a paper sack containing 2 egg sandwiches and a jar of soup beside the alley door. The elderly neighbor brought Amos across the vacant lot and showed Clara which outdoor pipe must be drained before the next freeze. Mrs. Baines mailed a copy of the Grand's original floor plan with the unsafe balcony marked in red pencil. None of them asked to see the money. None knew it existed. There may be a kindness you still remember because it arrived before you had found the words to ask for it. Perhaps someone left food, carried a box, made a telephone call, or simply believed your account of what had happened. What was the small kindness that helped you remain standing? That night, Clara placed the letter beneath the folded coat, serving as her pillow. The metal rested in its cotton beside the leather tool case, and the repaired coconut shells lay within reach of her hand. She slept while the theater settled around her beam, answering beam in the cold. The first measurable snow fell on December 2nd, 4.5 inches, laid evenly across Grand River Avenue and the broken roof of the theater. Clara watched it sift through the opening above the balcony, then went to the green room and read the roof chapter in Otis's repair manual 3 times. The section was indeed poor. She made her own figures on the back of a cue card. The safer rear roof measured 32 by 46 feet. Allowing 10% for cuts and damage, she needed 21 bundles of asphalt shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and nearly 12 pounds of roofing nails. The main auditorium would have to wait. First, she would seal the rooms in which the stove tools and trap compartments stood. Otis studied her calculation at the counter, corrected the overlap allowance, and disappeared into the storeroom. He returned with a roofing hatchet whose leather grip had been worn smooth. "My brother's," he said. "He will not be needing it." A retired roofer named Walter Klein arrived the next morning. He was 71, narrow through the shoulders and missing the tip of his left forefinger. He climbed the ladder Clara had braced against the rear wall, inspected the rafters, then came down without hurry. "I cannot pay much," Clara said. "I did not ask." For 11 days, they worked beneath skies that never fully brightened. They removed wet, sheathing cut sister rafters from sound fir and fastened them alongside the weakened members with carriage bolts. Walter snapped a chalk line across the felt and taught Clara to drive each nail in 3 strokes, 1 to set, 1 to seat, 1 to finish. On the 4th morning, he touched a nail head with the hatchet. "That nail's proud. I will drive it. Pull it." She did. A bent nail weakened the shingle around it, he explained, even when hammered flat. Clara began carrying a coffee tin for every nail that entered badly. They completed the rear roof on December 14. Snow began again before the final ladder was lowered, but none entered the green room. Clara stood beneath the repaired section and listened for dripping. There was none. By January, the chimney had become the next danger. Several exterior bricks had begun to spall their faces, separating in thin red flakes, while mortar near the roofline could be brushed into powder with 2 fingers. Walter advised rebuilding the upper 6 courses, but the sound brick below could remain. Otis supplied hydraulic lime, fire clay, and clean sand. For the joints nearest the flue, Clara mixed 1 part fire clay, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 3 parts sand, adding water by handfuls until the mortar held a ridge without cracking. She soaked each replacement brick before bedding it so the dry clay would not draw moisture from the mix too quickly. The work took 3 weeks. Most mornings remained in the 20s. Gloves made the joints clumsy, so Clara worked barehanded for short periods, pressing mortar with a narrow pointing trowel until her fingers went numb. Every 15 minutes, she climbed down, held both hands near the stove, and waited for the ache of returning blood. Wind crossed the roof without obstruction. It carried soot into her hair and dried the mortar edges too quickly unless she covered each completed section with damp burlap. One afternoon, a joint split from corner to corner. Clara removed it while still soft, cleaned the bed, and laid it again. The test fire took place on January 27. Walter stood in the alley while Clara burned newspaper, then kindling, then 2 pieces of oak. No smoke escaped through the repaired joints. Above the roof, the chimney released a straight gray column that rose cleanly before the wind took it east. Walter watched for another minute. "That will draw." Clara warmed soup on the stove without opening a window. The floors revealed themselves only after the soot was gone. Beneath dirt, candle wax, and decades of theater dust lay wide white pine planks secured with hand-cut rose-head nails. Many boards were scarred by scenery wheels and iron-shod trunks, but few were rotten. Clara decided not to replace honest ware. She rented a random orbit sander from Otis for $14 per day. The machine pulled hard toward the walls and filled the room with a fine resinous haze. She worked in 3 passes, 80 grit to remove grime and raised fibers, 120 to soften the scratches, then 220 along the grain. Each rosehead nail had to be set below the surface before the sander crossed it. Clara moved on her knees with a punch and hammer, testing each dark head with her thumbnail. The first oil coat vanished into the pine almost immediately. The second remained long enough to be worked with cloth. After the third, she closed the room and allowed a full 48-hour cure. The color shifted from dark honey toward mahogany wherever old heat and foot traffic had compressed the grain. The marks of scenery wagons remained visible beneath the finished long parallel arcs crossing the floor toward the stage. One morning, Clara woke before dawn with no willingness to lift the sander. She carried her coat to the edge of the river and sat where winter reeds stood through thin ice. A great blue heron waited in the shallows, motionless, except for one careful step every few minutes. Clara watched until the bird opened its wings and crossed the gray water. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned to the floor and completed the final pass without rushing. 8 windows served the rooms behind and beneath the stage. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last retained an original pane dated in the building records to 1788, faintly rippled and thicker along its lower edge. Clara preserved it. For the empty openings, Otis cut replacement glass 1/8 of an inch smaller than each rabbet. Clara removed the hardened putty with a glazing knife warmed near the stove, then brushed linseed oil into the dry wood so it would not pull oil from the new compound. She rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms into narrow ropes, pressed them firmly into the rebate, set the glass against the bedding, and secured each pane with glazier's points. The exterior bevel took practice. Her first line sagged in the middle and had to be lifted out and rolled again. The sash cords had rotted to brown threads. Clara replaced them with quarter-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye. She lowered the iron weight into its pocket, slowly listening to be certain it moved without striking the plaster. The preserved pane required only cleaning and a narrow repair along its lower putty line. In afternoon light, it bent the view of the walnut trees, slightly making each branch appear to move even when the air was still. Clara installed the final sash on February 28. As she tested the balance, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. Its black cap and white cheek remained sharply visible through the new glass. The bird turned once toward the window, struck the branch with its beak, and flew beyond the roof line. The sash stayed open at any height Clara placed it. She lowered it gently and fastened the latch. The walls near the chimney failed first. Their original horsehair plaster had been pressed over hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven enough to hold the keys firmly for more than a century. Where heat and water had met, however, the plaster released in curved shells. Clara's first 3 patches cracked before drying, one at the edge, one through the center, and one along every line where new material touched old. She removed them without argument. Otis brought an old feed sack containing horsehair saved by his father. Clara washed it, cut the strands short, and mixed them into lime plaster until each handful pulled apart without clumping. She dampened the exposed lath and pressed on a scored scratch coat, forcing plaster through the gaps so it curled behind the oak. The brown coat followed at 3/8 of an inch. She kept it covered and allowed a 72-hour cure before applying the final 1/8 inch coat with a steel trowel. The surface was not perfectly flat, neither were the surrounding walls. Clara feathered the edges until the repair disappeared in evening light. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Vale began leaving paper bags at the alley door every Tuesday and Friday. She was a small woman with red reading glasses suspended from a beaded chain. The bags held practical food bean soup sealed in jars, thick bread, boiled eggs, or 2 slices of apple cake wrapped separately so the icing would not stick. Clara carried the 3rd empty jar back to the Olympia lunch counter with coins in her palm. Doris pushed both coins and jar across the counter. In candles when the shop reopens. Clara had not said there would be a shop. Doris turned to refill a customer's coffee, ending the matter. Caleb Morrow arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, balancing a splitting maul across the handlebars. He was 17, long-legged, and wore 1 red wool glove and 1 brown one. Without asking permission, he stacked fallen walnut limbs beside the alley and split them into stove lengths. Clara offered him $2. He shook his head and drove the maul through another round. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. He returned the following Saturday with a file and sharpened the maul on the stage while Clara repaired a length of rain-wheel track. They worked for nearly an hour without speaking, the file moving across steel between the softer clicks of her wooden pegs. Reverend Boyd passed each morning at 7:20. He was tall, slightly stooped, and always wore a gray felt hat even in rain. At first he merely tipped it toward the alley door. Later he began carrying broken plaster to Clara's debris pile when he found her working outside. One morning in March he stopped beside the well. "Keep her warm, Lord." 4 words. Then he touched the brim of his hat and continued toward the church. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11th, exactly 1 year after the date on Elias's letter. Its door opened beneath the lower stair and descended by 7 granite steps worn shallow at their centers. The room measured 12 by 15 feet. Fieldstone paved the floor, fitted closely enough that only narrow seams of packed earth remained between the stones. At the center lay one dressed granite slab, smoother and lighter than the others. A craft mark had been carved into it, 2 curved shells meeting at their narrow ends. Clara swept the slab, tested its edges, and left it where it was. Elias had taught her that an unopened thing was not always an invitation. Under the 3rd step, her broom struck wood. A small oak box had been wedged deep behind the riser. Its lid slid sideways along a hidden groove. Inside lay a brass key, green at the teeth, with a bow shaped like the same paired shell symbol. Beneath it rested a tintype wrapped in black cloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the theater in the summer of 1903. The facade behind her was clean, the marquee painted, the doors open to daylight. She held a wooden clapper in one hand and looked toward the camera with Clara's narrow face, Clara's dark brows, and the same slight unevenness at the corners of her mouth. On the reverse, scratched into the metal, were the words, "Lenora Mercer, daughter of Silas, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara carried the tintype upstairs and placed it beside Elias's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel. She tried it in no lock and asked no one what it might open. Snow withdrew from the alleys and gray ridges. The Detroit River grew loud against its retaining walls, and green walnut catkins lengthened above the well. By April, the rear room stayed dry through rain. The chimney drew. All 8 windows opened. Clara cleaned the thunderboards and repaired 1 leather strap, but she did not attempt a full performance. She would not begin the complete craft that spring. Instead, she selected 1 worn silver $50 from the cash and recorded its date before spending it. With the money, she bought new muslin maple strips, rosin shot, and dried peas. She practiced on small samples, listening after every cut and adjustment. One rain sound was too fast. One door hinge sounded falsely old. A set of hoofbeats became convincing only when she replaced clean sand with grit gathered from the alley. Nothing was rushed. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara completed her first full Foley piece. It was not thunder or a train wreck. She chose a simpler scene from one of the surviving Q notebooks, a woman walking home through snow, pausing at a wooden gate, then entering an empty kitchen where a clock had stopped. Clara built the snow sound from cornstarch folded inside muslin. She shaped the gate latch from oak and brass until its release carried the right tired weight. For the kitchen door, she used Elias's mounted hinge warmed near the stove and worked with 1 drop of oil. Doris, Caleb, Otis, Mrs. Baines, and Reverend Boyd sat in the 6th row. No scenery stood on stage. No actor spoke. Clara began in darkness. Footsteps crossed the boards behind the curtain. Snow compressed beneath each one. A sleeve brushed wood. The gate lifted, hesitated, and closed. Then came a key, a door, the faint hollow of an unoccupied room, and the single dry click of a stopped clock being touched. When the lights rose, no one applauded immediately. Otis looked down at both hands. Then Doris began softly, and the others joined her. By then, the restored interior did not resemble a new theater. Clara had refused that kind of erasure. The rose-head nails remained visible in the floors. The patched walls showed slight waves beneath the paint. She preserved one water stain above the lower stair and kept the repaired copper wire around Elias's coconut shells. The safe rear roof covered a workshop, 2 rehearsal rooms, and a small public seating area. The collapsed balcony remained closed behind a timber barrier Walter had built before his knees stopped allowing roof work. The grand was sound where it needed to be sound. On February 11, 2025, Clara took the brass key from the mantel. She had survived 3 winters in the theater, each one different. The first had taught her where cold entered. The second showed where old repairs were dishonest. The third passed without a bucket placed beneath any ceiling. She crossed the vacant lot to the center walnut tree. The iron plate on its north side had become nearly hidden beneath new bark. Clara cleared the seam with a wooden wedge and removed the 2 square nails. Behind the plate was a brass keyway she had never noticed, protected by a thin leather flap. The key turned once. A narrow compartment opened within the trunk, lined with sheet copper darkened by age. Clara reached inside and withdrew a folded 48-star American flag wrapped in oilcloth and a small envelope addressed in Clara Mercer's hand. The note was dated June 18, 1918. Thomas has gone to France and the theater sounds too large without his boots beneath the stage. I have placed Father's flag here because the shop must keep no altar except the workbench. When Thomas returns, he may take it down. If he does not, let whoever comes after us decide where honor belongs. A sound can carry grief without enlarging it. Make the door close. Let the footsteps continue. Clara Mercer. Thomas returned from France in 1919. The family records Mrs. Baines later found showed that he resumed work at the Grand and named his first son Elias Daniel. He had left the flag inside the tree. Clara took the flag to the theater and unfolded it once across the walnut table. The cotton was yellowed at the folds, but complete. She placed Lenora's note beside the Spanish War Service medal and understood why Elias had not chosen their final resting place. On November 11, 2025, she carried both to Woodmere Cemetery. The date marked 107 years since the armistice ending the First World War. Mrs. Baines located Silas Mercer's grave, a modest stone beneath an elm, and the cemetery superintendent permitted Clara to place the medal and folded flag there for 1 hour. No announcement was made. Reverend Boyd spoke the names Silas, Lenora, Thomas, James, and Elias. Caleb stood with his bicycle beside the path, now too tall for the frame. Doris held the flag at one corner while Clara brushed leaves from the stone. Afterward, the medal returned to the theater. The flag went into an acid-free box beneath the walnut table with Lenora's note and a written record of the hour it had spent in daylight. The cash remained largely untouched. Clara used $0.50 for her first practice materials, $1 Morgan to replace the dangerous electrical panel, and $2 when the final sash cord failed unexpectedly during a freezing rain. The city required a permit fee in modern currency, so she sold 1 additional silver dollar rather than break a bank-wrapped stack of bills. 5 coins. Everything else went back beneath the trapdoor. She replaced the cotton, oiled the hinges, and sealed the bills in archival sleeves. On top, she placed a new envelope bearing 5 words. For the next one who listens. The $85,000 could have rebuilt the balcony, quickly installed polished seats, and covered the walls in new velvet. Clara chose slower work. She paid for structural safety, fire prevention insurance, and materials only when each need became exact. The money remained an inheritance, not an instruction to spend. The workshop reopened without a ceremony. Doris wrote an index card in blue ink and pinned it to the corkboard beside the Olympia lunch counter register. Grand Theater Sound Workshop Saturdays 10-2 repairs demonstrations, quiet listening, enter through alley. 3 people came the first Saturday. One brought a radio script from 1946. Another carried a box of wooden spoons. The third sat for 40 minutes and said nothing. By spring, Clara kept a mailing list in an old ticket ledger. More than 40 names filled the pages, though seldom more than 8 people attended at once. She preferred it that way. Each visitor could stand close enough to see how the objects were held. Caleb returned in June, carrying a long parcel wrapped in a wool blanket. He had finished trade school and now worked at a cabinet shop across the river. His red and brown gloves were gone, but the splitting maul still stood in Clara's woodpile with his initials burned into the handle. I unwrapped a hand-carved walnut sign. Mercer Theatrical Sound and Daughters. Clara ran her thumb across the final words. There were no daughters in the shop name, she said. There were always daughters in the work. He placed the sign above the entrance to the lower room. The carving was not perfectly centered. The ampersand leaned slightly toward daughters as though making room for the word. Clara left it untouched. That autumn she began her own letter. She used 9 sheets of plain paper and Elias's fountain pen repaired by Otis before his hands became too unsteady for small screws. She did not know who would read it or whether the reader would be related by bloodwork accident or need. She wrote about the roof dimensions, the chimney mix, and the place where Walter's chalk line remained beneath the final shingle course. She described the walnut key and the granite slab she had still never lifted. She warned that the rain wheel ran too quickly when filled above 1/3 of its depth. Then she began the first page again. My dear one, whoever you are. She explained that the Grand did not require rescue. Buildings were often spoken of as though they had spent their empty years begging for human attention. This one had not begged. It had held its beams, kept its compartments, sheltered tools, and returned every careful sound placed within it. A future owner might repair the balcony. Another might leave it closed. Someone might use the workshop for work Clara could not yet imagine. The obligation was not to repeat her choices. The obligation was to listen before choosing. She folded the letter along 3 measured creases and placed it above the sealed money beneath Elias's Q notebook and beside Lenora's tintype, for the place that listens back. On winter evenings, Clara still crossed the stage after turning off the workshop lamps. The restored windows reflected the aisle in 8 narrow pieces. Behind the barrier, the broken balcony rested in darkness, neither hidden nor displayed. She checked the stove, touched the trapdoor seam with 1 foot, and listened until the building completed its nightly settling. The abandoned Grand Theater waits. It has always waited. At the county annex, Mrs. Baines retired in the spring of 2026. Before leaving, she cleaned her desk and found a single worn dollar bill beneath the drawer liner. Clara had placed it there on the day the deed was stamped, believing a clerk who remembered Elias should hold 1 piece of the purchase. Mrs. Baines left the bill in the drawer. She wrote on its edge in small blue letters. The first payment was enough. Then she closed the desk for the next clerk.